The quiet unraveling of my marriage began almost imperceptibly, like the slow creep of dusk at the end of a day. My wife, Lucy, and I had built a life that, on the surface, seemed everything we wanted. We had 2 beautiful kids, a house filled with our memories, and jobs that allowed us the time and stability to enjoy it all. For years, I thought we were genuinely happy. But as I'd eventually learn, the truth was more complex, layered with secrets she'd hidden well and painful questions I hadn't dared to ask. The first hint of trouble was so small that I almost brushed it off. Lucy started to act distant, her laughter seeming more forced, her eyes darting away when she thought I might catch a glimpse of her thoughts. I'd shrug it off initially, telling myself it was just stress from work or the exhaustion of daily life. But her work trips started becoming more frequent, and her late nights increased. Each time she assured me, "It's nothing, just a project for a big client," or, "You know how competitive my field is, this is for us." I wanted to believe her. Trust had always been the cornerstone of our relationship. We'd never been the couple that kept secrets from each other. In fact, it was one of the things I'd cherished most. But as the weeks passed, it became harder to ignore the signs. One evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, Lucy left her phone on the kitchen counter. She'd run upstairs to grab something, and as she walked away, the screen lit up with a text from someone named Ryan, a name I hadn't seen before. My eyes barely skimmed the message, but the words "tonight" and "miss you" were unmistakable. My heart dropped. I looked up, and just then, she was coming back downstairs. I didn't confront her. Not yet. I didn't know what to say, and part of me was afraid to find out more. The message replayed in my mind over and over, stirring a sickening cocktail of anger, fear, and a desperate need for answers. That night, as I lay beside her in bed, pretending to be asleep, I felt as if the bed had become a chasm separating us. She drifted off peacefully, and I lay awake, my mind racing through every detail of our lives, searching for other signs I might have missed. Over the next few days, I started noticing things I had previously ignored, the faint scent of unfamiliar cologne lingering on her clothes, the way she'd avoid eye contact when I asked about her day, her new obsession with checking her phone under the table during dinner. Piece by piece, the puzzle started coming together, and the picture it formed was nothing short of betrayal. But confronting her was out of the question, at least, not yet. I needed more than just a feeling, I needed proof. I found myself consumed with the need to know everything, every detail she thought she'd kept hidden. So, in quiet moments when she wasn't around, I began my investigation. I went through her phone whenever I had the chance, noting down numbers and matching her supposed work events with real events in her calendar. The more I searched, the clearer it became. Lucy was seeing someone else, and she was using her business trips as an excuse to slip away. What stung the most was the subtlety of it all. There had been no grand showdown, no loud accusations or slamming doors. Instead, she'd quietly rewritten the rules of our marriage without my consent. I could have been angry, and in some moments, the rage flared up so violently that I thought I'd burst. But mostly, I felt a dull, gnawing ache, an emptiness that crept into the corners of my day and refused to let go. As the days turned into weeks, I devised a plan. I wasn't about to let her get away with it, and yet, I didn't want a messy confrontation. My pain had hardened into a cold resolve, a need for something that would show her exactly what she'd done to us, to me, without ever needing to raise my voice. I'd have my revenge, but it would be measured, precise, something that would strike at the heart of everything she thought she could control. And so, I waited, biding my time, pretending not to notice when she'd slip away for another work meeting, my face expressionless as she recited her rehearsed excuses. I became an actor in our own marriage, playing my part to perfection, while beneath the surface, my plan took shape. The day would come soon when she'd realize the extent of her betrayal, and I'd be the one to expose it. The days following my quiet decision to gather proof felt surreal. I moved through my routine like a ghost, going to work, handling our kids' schedules, pretending with her at family dinners, all while a storm raged inside me. Each interaction with Lucy was tinted with the bitterness of knowing the truth but holding back the confrontation. It was as if I were watching my life through a window, seeing each moment but not really part of it. One evening, when Lucy was out on yet another late-night work dinner, I decided to start by checking our bank statements and credit card bills. This was the first step in my plan to unearth the evidence of her double life. Our bank records were meticulously organized, something we had set up together back when our relationship felt real. So it was easy to pick out the outliers: charges at fancy restaurants I hadn't heard about, unexplained Uber rides, hotel charges on the night she was supposed to be at conferences. Each line item was like a little punch to the gut, and as the list grew, so did my resolve. But it wasn't until I found her phone bill that the full picture came into focus. There was one number that appeared again and again, at odd hours, often late at night or during times she was supposedly working. My hands shook as I dialed it from my phone, hanging up just before it could ring. I didn't need to know who he was yet. What I had was enough to confirm my worst fears: Lucy was in deep, and she didn't think I'd ever find out. Then came the question of how I'd confront her. I wanted it to be as painful for her as it had been for me, but I didn't want a screaming match or a drawn-out argument. I wanted to hit her where it hurt, right in the comfort of the world she thought she'd built without consequence. And that's when I realized the power of the silent reveal. I didn't have to shout or accuse her. I just had to let her know, in a way she couldn't ignore, that I'd seen everything and that I was done. In the meantime, I kept gathering evidence, watching her closely whenever she was around. I noticed the way she'd check her reflection just a little too carefully before leaving, the way her eyes would flash with nervous excitement when she mentioned work. I stayed calm, counting down the days until I'd execute my plan, telling myself that this silence, this patience, would make it all the more devastating. One night, as we were sitting at the dinner table, our kids chattering away about their day, Lucy's phone buzzed, lighting up with a message. I watched her as she glanced at the screen, a small smile playing at her lips before she caught herself and slipped the phone back into her purse. I took a sip of my water, hiding my clenched jaw, and reminded myself that the end was in sight. The next day, I took my findings to a lawyer. I wanted this divorce to be swift and as brutal as possible. I'd spent enough years building this life to know exactly how to dismantle it. I didn't want Lucy to take a single thing from our marriage without knowing the pain she'd caused me, and I certainly wasn't going to let her walk away with the house or the family we'd built on lies. The lawyer listened, flipping through the stack of phone records, receipts, and messages I'd printed, his face expressionless but his eyes sharp. When he looked up, he nodded, and I could tell he was on board. We set the wheels in motion that day, starting with the papers to end the marriage. The last step was timing. I knew she had another work trip coming up the following week, so I planned to have her served the morning after she returned. I wanted her to walk back into this house, expecting everything to be as it was, only to realize that I'd cut the foundation out from under her. That night, as she slept beside me, unaware of the storm brewing, I felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in months, I wasn't just reacting to her betrayal. I was taking back control. When the morning of her trip arrived, she barely looked at me as she packed, focused instead on her phone as if I wasn't even there. The kids were at school, and it was just the two of us in the house. I watched her gather her things, slipping into the routine she thought would shield her. She looked up and gave me a distracted smile, saying, "I'll be back late Sunday. Should I pick up groceries on the way back?" I nodded, managing a polite smile, and simply said, "Don't worry about it. I'll take care of everything." She seemed almost relieved, and that alone stung more than I expected. As she walked out the door, I felt a rush of satisfaction. She thought she had me fooled, but by the time she returned, she'd know exactly how mistaken she was. The house was quiet after she left, and for the first time in ages, I felt free. I went about my day, finalizing the details with my lawyer, ensuring the papers would be ready to be served just as I planned. I allowed myself to imagine her reaction, the disbelief, the regret. But there was no turning back now. The life she'd taken for granted, the loyalty she'd thrown away, would all come crashing down. And I would be the one to watch her face it alone. The days leading up to Lucy's return were charged with a tense kind of anticipation. It felt like waiting for a storm that you knew would come, but whose power you couldn't quite imagine. I went about my life with a calm I barely recognized in myself, preparing everything with precision. Each task, each errand, felt like one final arrangement in the dismantling of a life I thought I'd continue to share with her. But now, I was constructing something entirely different, her reckoning. I had informed the lawyer to ensure that the papers would be delivered early Monday morning, right after she'd returned from her weekend business trip. I imagined her shock as she'd received the thick, unmistakable envelope bearing the reality of her choices. There would be no explanation required. No warnings. Just the cold, unignorable truth. On Sunday, I spent the day tidying up the house, something I hadn't cared much for in recent months, but today it felt right. This was the final scene of our lives together, and I wanted it to look exactly as she'd left it, almost as if nothing had changed, except, of course, everything had. There was something deeply satisfying about setting everything in order, as if I were arranging props for a final act she would never see coming. That night, I laid down in bed, pulling the covers up to an empty side that I knew would soon be permanently vacant. I must have dozed off because I didn't hear her come in. I awoke to the soft rustling sounds from the other room, her suitcase being set down, her coat sliding off. For a moment, I lay there, staring at the ceiling, the silence of the room thick around me. She tiptoed into the bedroom, probably trying to avoid waking me, and it almost made me laugh. For someone who had so thoroughly dismantled our lives, she still thought she could ease her way back in without causing any disruption. But I stayed still, waiting, wanting her to see nothing was out of place, that there was no hint of the bomb about to explode in her hands. The next morning, as she slept, I got up quietly and made coffee, preparing breakfast for the kids as if it were any normal Monday. It was, after all, one of those small rituals that I planned to hold on to once this whole thing was over. She joined me in the kitchen, yawning, acting as if nothing was amiss. She poured herself a cup of coffee, her tired eyes barely meeting mine as she muttered a good morning. "Late flight?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual, controlled. "Yeah, it was delayed," she said, rubbing her eyes. "Just exhausted." I didn't respond, just nodded, sipping my coffee as if her words held any weight. I kept the calm, almost mundane silence, savoring the last moment of her oblivion. She had no idea that everything was about to change, that her facade was seconds away from shattering. It was about 30 minutes later when the doorbell rang. I stood up slowly, my eyes on her as she looked up, surprised. She didn't expect anyone, and neither did I. But I knew exactly who it was, and I wanted to watch her face as reality knocked on our door. "Can you get that?" she asked, looking distracted as she placed her mug down. "No, Lucy," I replied, standing back as she gave me a puzzled look. "I think it's for you." She frowned but walked toward the door, casting a quick glance over her shoulder, probably wondering if I knew who it was. I stayed where I was, waiting, listening as she opened the door. I heard the faint murmur of the courier, followed by a moment of silence before she took the envelope, closed the door, and stepped back into the room. Her eyes were locked on the packet in her hands, and a strange kind of dread seemed to settle over her face. "What's this?" she asked, glancing up at me, her voice uncertain. "Why don't you open it and find out?" I replied, keeping my voice as steady as I could, though I could feel my pulse quicken. This was the moment I'd envisioned so many times, and it was somehow better and worse than I'd imagined. She hesitated, her fingers nervously picking at the edges before she slid them under the seal, tearing it open. Her eye scanned the top of the page, and I watched as her face changed from confusion to shock, her mouth parting as if she couldn't quite believe what she was reading. It was as though she'd been struck physically, the weight of the papers bearing down on her in a way she'd never anticipated. "Divorce," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She looked up at me, eyes wide with disbelief. You're serious?" "As serious as you were, Lucy," I replied, the bitterness slipping into my tone. "I'm just giving you what you wanted all along, right?" Her face went pale, and she opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The usual composure, the excuses, the fake stories she'd been telling, it all fell apart in an instant, leaving her exposed, vulnerable, the woman she'd hidden behind all those lies. "I thought..." I thought we could work through it, she stammered, grasping at anything that might soften the blow. I felt a flash of anger rise up, sharp and cold. Work through it? Do you think I'm an idiot, Lucy? Did you really think you could just pretend none of this happened? That I wouldn't find out? She shook her head, tears beginning to gather in her eyes. I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I love you, I swear. The words felt like salt in a wound, but I held my ground, refusing to let her tear down the resolve I'd spent so long building. Love? If this is love, Lucy, then I want nothing to do with it. She started to cry, her hand shaking as she gripped the papers, her gaze darting between them and me. I could see her scrambling for something, anything to hold on to, but there was nothing left for her here. The trust, the life we'd built, it was all gone, swept away by her own choices. Please, let's talk about this, she whispered, the desperation clear in her voice. We can fix this, I'll do anything. I felt a strange sense of satisfaction, watching her try to piece together a way out of the mess she'd made. But I was beyond caring, beyond forgiving. There's nothing left to fix, Lucy. This was your choice. I turned, walking toward the door, leaving her standing in the hallway, holding the remnants of our marriage in her trembling hands. As I closed the door behind me, I felt a sense of liberation, a weight lifting that had been dragging me down for too long. I had finally taken control of my life back, leaving her with the consequences she never thought she'd have to face. As I walked out into the cool morning air, I allowed myself a single, deep breath. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain, I was finally free from the lies, the betrayal, and the illusion of a marriage that had been shattered long ago. And somehow, that was enough. The days following our confrontation were hollow, almost colorless, like the world had been drained of its life. I moved through the motions, trying to find a new rhythm for myself, but I was stumbling. I'd spent so much time preparing for that moment, crafting my plan, picturing her devastation, that I hadn't really considered what life would be like afterward. Now, with the echo of that confrontation fading, a stark emptiness took its place. Lucy tried calling and texting over the next few days, but I ignored her, keeping things focused on logistics, the last remnants of a relationship turned to paperwork. Our lawyers were handling everything now, but my nights were long and silent, filled with questions I'd never wanted to ask. I thought I'd feel triumphant, free, but there was a gnawing loneliness I couldn't shake, something that seeped in quietly and took root in my mind. One evening, about a week after she'd left, I received a call from her mother, Jane. I was startled to see her number on my screen. We hadn't spoken since the day I served Lucy the papers. Jane's voice was calm, but I could sense an undercurrent of tension, something in her words that carried more weight than she let on. Will, she said quietly, I think you should come over. Lucy wants to see you. I felt a rush of anger. After everything, she still thought she had a say, that she could just summon me like that. Jane, I don't think there's anything left to talk about. We're done. There was a pause, then a sigh that seemed heavy with years of emotion. Will, please. Just, please come. Reluctantly, I agreed, and that night, I found myself outside her mother's house, staring at the familiar door. I hadn't been here in months, not since everything had started to unravel. I hesitated, wondering if I should just turn back, but something in Jane's voice kept me there, lingering. Finally, I stepped up to the door and knocked. Jane answered, looking older than I remembered, her eyes tired, her face marked with worry. She hugged me briefly, then stepped back, her expression unreadable. She's upstairs, she said simply. I climbed the stairs slowly, feeling a mix of dread and something I couldn't quite name, maybe a faint, buried hope that there was something more to understand, a resolution I hadn't been able to find. When I reached the door to Lucy's old room, I paused, steeling myself before I knocked and entered. Lucy was sitting on the edge of the bed, looking out the window, her silhouette framed against the dim evening light. She looked thinner, her face drawn, and when she turned to look at me, I barely recognized the woman in front of me. Her eyes, once so lively, were dull, haunted, and her shoulders slumped under a weight I couldn't see. Will, she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you for coming." I didn't respond, standing in the doorway, unsure of what to say. This wasn't the confrontation I'd prepared for, the triumph I'd planned. Instead, I felt a pang of something like pity, a bitter, twisted sympathy for the broken figure sitting before me. "I know you have no reason to listen to me," she began, her voice shaky. "But I need you to understand. I never wanted to hurt you. I thought I'd have time to fix things before it all came crashing down." And then, when I realized it was too late, she trailed off, her words lost in a breathless sob. I clenched my fists, struggling to keep my emotions in check. "Lucy, I don't know what you expect me to say. You lied. You made your choices, and now you're dealing with the consequences. I can't change that." She looked down, nodding slowly. I know I don't deserve anything from you. But I need to tell you the truth, at least now." Her voice was raw, and she started talking, hesitating, stumbling over her words. She spoke of a loneliness that had crept into her life, her feelings of inadequacy, a hollow need for validation that she couldn't shake. She talked about feeling lost in her own skin, uncertain of herself, trying to fill the gaps with someone else's attention. Her words painted a bleak picture of a woman I hadn't seen, someone who had hidden her pain even as she inflicted it on me. The anger I'd held onto so tightly began to waver, replaced by a strange sadness, a grief for something I couldn't quite name. It was like mourning a ghost, a lost part of us that had slipped away without either of us noticing. At some point, I realized she was crying, her body shaking with silent sobs. I wanted to turn away, to hold on to the anger that had sustained me. But against my better judgment, I crossed the room and sat beside her, the silence stretching between us, thick and impenetrable. And there, for the first time, I felt the full weight of what we had lost, not just our marriage, but the people we'd once been, the trust, the comfort, the love that had somehow slipped through our fingers. After what felt like hours, she looked up at me, her eyes rimmed with red, a hollow desperation in her gaze. "I'm sorry, Will. I can't fix this. I know that. I just wanted you to know that. I'll always love you, even if it doesn't matter now." I nodded, unable to find the words, feeling the weight of those words settle over me. They were too little, too late, but somehow they still held a power that broke something in me. We sat there, two people tethered by a shared history, both knowing there was no way to go back. A week later, I got a call from Jane again. Her voice was shaking, and I knew, even before she spoke, that something terrible had happened. "Will? Lucy, she's gone." Her words were choked, strangled, barely more than a whisper. My heart froze, a numbness spreading through my body. I tried to speak, but no sound came out. It was as if the world had stopped, the air itself thick with silence. "Gone?" I finally managed, my voice hollow. She took her own life, Will. Last night. I don't know why she didn't reach out." The room spun around me, and I felt my knees weaken, my mind struggling to grasp the words. The weight of her absence settled over me, a brutal finality that left me gasping, struggling for air. I had wanted her to face the consequences, to feel the pain she'd caused, but not this. I had never wanted it to end like this. In the days that followed, I found myself drifting, haunted by memories of her, of us. I replayed our last conversation over and over, wondering if there was something I could have said, something I could have done. The anger that had sustained me for so long had nowhere left to go, replaced by a grief that I couldn't shake, a sorrow that seeped into the cracks of my soul. I went to her funeral, standing at the back, watching as people spoke of the woman she had been, the life she had lived, the love she had given. The words felt like lies, hollow and empty, but they clung to me, reminding me of everything we had lost, everything we could never get back. In the end, I left with nothing but regrets, haunted by the memory of the woman I had loved, the life we had built, and the bitter, twisted end we had come to. I had thought revenge would bring closure, but all it had done was leave me alone, trapped in a world without her, a life stripped of meaning. And as I walked away from her grave, I realized that some betrayals can never be avenged, some wounds can never truly heal. The anger I had held so tightly had turned to ashes, leaving me with a sadness that would follow me, a reminder of everything I had lost, of the love I would never have again.